Hi again, I'm Juan Linde Domingo, and in this video I will continue talking a little bit more about decoding. I thought that I could call this session cross-decoding, although this is a very general term. But my main idea is to focus about some analysis that, okay, they are not exclusive of classifier, but of course they has been traditionally connected with them. First, let's take a look. I wanted to talk about time generalization, explain what it is, how it can be interpreted, and some simple practical advices. And we will talk about these tips a little bit more during the practice sessions. Second, we will talk about cross-decoding between dataset coming from different tasks, experiment, or even between participants. And this will be a type of the scenario where I think using a time generalization approach has a clear benefit. Finally, I would like to point a paper or some paper about one topic that I would like to talk more, but it was not possible. Okay, is feature selection. In the previous video, we talked about how time result classification could be applied to high-resolution neuroimaging techniques like EEG or MEG, and I'm talking about time resolution. The main idea we discussed before was about the possibility of running independent classifier per data point or per time point. So training and testing our dataset in every single point. For instance, if we have a time resolution of 1000 Hz, we could test and train the classifier in each millisecond. One classifier train and test in the first millisecond, one classifier train and test in the second millisecond, and so on. However, depending on our question of interest, we could go a little bit beyond this approach. Imagine, if we are interested on understanding the temporal dynamic of visual perception, we probably want to know whether some neural code reoccur over time. Or we can have questions like, is the brain processing an imagery during the first 100 milliseconds in a similar manner than after 500 milliseconds? One approach that could be quite helpful is to take a look to the time generalization matrix. To do that, we are going to run the classifier in every single time point and test this model in every single point too. To visualize this, we will need two dimensions. So we will have in the y-axis those times where the classifier was trained, and in the x-axis those times where the classifier was tested. For example, we can treat the classifier at time 0 and then test this model in every single point, including the time 0 too. Then we can repeat this in the entire y-axis to complete our matrix, and boom, we will have our time generalization matrix. The diagonal, the red line, corresponds to those points where both training and testing times are the same. So the diagonal contains the same result that we saw previously in this figure. What is interesting here is what is happening off diagonal. For example, you can see that training the classifier with time points at 400 milliseconds allow you to decode more or less what is happening at 400 milliseconds. Fine. But also, it allows you to decode what is happening in a different moment, at 300 milliseconds. So the neural representation seems to be repeated. Okay? So if for any reason right now it's not super clear for you what the time generalization matrix represents, no worries, it can be a little bit tricky at the beginning, so take your time. And also, to be honest, though for some people it's really easy to interpret what is happening here, I also find it a little bit tricky. These matrices can help us to identify some brain dynamics. To do that, we can take a look to different patterns that can emerge. But it's important to know that these examples that I'm going to show do not correspond to real data. Imagine that after presenting some images at time 0, we find that our classifier only performed well along the diagonal during a relatively long period of time. In this case, we could assume that the neural code is highly time-specific, but there is a sequential processing of information. In this next example, we can see other type of sequential but not continuous brain processing, where the neural code is also relative time-specific. There are also cases where the neural code is not time-specific, and the same information seems to be processed in a sustained fashion, As you can see here, we can decode the signal in one time using more than 4 very different data points. In other cases, we can find patterns suggesting that the brain reactivates on neural code that was previously used in other data points. Or why not? We can find a time reverse processing that it can look like that. But this kind of pattern could make sense only if we are training and testing the classifier with different events. And we will talk about this a little bit later. If you want to take a look to other patterns, have a better overview of different studies using time generalization matrices, I can point you to this paper. However, the results that we obtain in the lab are always more complicated. What we usually can see in our classifier is a mix of different patterns that show us the complexity of information processing. So in this matrix that I'm showing in the right side, here we can see how a LDA classifier works or can decode the identity of 8 different pictures during visual processing. So the theoretical chance level of our classifier here should be 12.5%. So here we see that clear sequential processing the first 300 milliseconds, followed by a more sustained processing. The first one has been related to low-level processing of the images like color, line, etc. And the second one could be related to higher-level information processing like semantic feature of the pictures. But, as I said before, interpreting these matrices is not an easy task, and to understand some of the potential effects that we can see here required to understand the nature of EEG. And a good example of that we have in this preprint that I really recommend you to read. Now that we hopefully have a better understanding about what time generalization represents, I would like to point something that can be obvious, but it's not less important. So running this analysis requires a lot of computation power, and it can take an incredible amount of time. So there are some really simple advices to be faster, to use less resources, and also to be a little bit nicer with the planet. The first one is downsampling the data. So reducing the number of time points will have an incredible impact if you don't want to run this analysis for days. And generally, you don't need a 1000 by 1000 pixel resolution to interpret your time generalization matrices. Depending on your question, you would like to have a minimum of time resolution, of course, but in general, using a signal with a sampling rate of 100 Hz should be more than enough. Second, you can think about reducing the number of features that you will use to fit your classifier. As we saw previously, instead of using, let's say, 120 channels, a good idea is using PCA and keep only those components that display a significant amount of variance in your data. Hopefully, you will run the classifier using, let's say, only 60 features. If possible, not only for this analysis, use parallel processing in MATLAB. They will allow you to run parallel loops in your multi-core computer or cluster. So you can run simultaneously different participants or classifiers. I know that sometimes it can be a little bit tedious to prepare this loop, but in MATLAB, this is very well documented. Finally, another consideration that could make a difference is to change your cross-validation method. For instance, if possible, avoid using a leave one out cross-validation here, or if you normally use a k-fold 10 approach, maybe you want to consider moving to k-fold 5. As you know, these little changes make a big difference. Once that we have our nice time generalization matrix, a good question is how we can identify where the classifier is significantly better than chance. And of course, here we have a multiple comparison problem. We have thousands, almost millions of comparisons in some cases. So we will have a lot of meaningless points that are going to look different from chance level. That means that we have to use a multiple comparison correction. For example, a general practice here is to use a cluster permutation test. In case that you are not familiar with this type of corrections, don't worry, we will discuss this in a different video. So now we are going to talk about training and testing our classifier in different experimental sessions or tasks, where using a time generalization approach could be really helpful. So we know that training and testing dataset should be always treated as independent information because we don't want to train and test the classifier with the same information. So to do that, we saw different types of cross-validation approaches. But sometimes we want to do something a bit different that mainly depends on our research question. Sometimes we want to cross-decode information between different moments of the experiment, different tasks, or across participants. For example, if we want to see how concrete visual information of one item is represented when participants try to remember this item, we can train a classifier with these images during encoding and test the classifier during retrieval. This will help us to see how neural representation could be generalized between two different moments. Maybe this sounds a little bit weird right now, but let's see some example of cross-decoding. The first example of cross-decoding could be using different blocks to train and test your classifier. But only you have classes equally distributed by block. Also, you should be really careful choosing the blocks, otherwise the classifier could pick up some signal similarity based on temporal proximity. Generally, this method can be used to cross-validate your classifier, but also a similar approach could be implemented to test the chain of neural representation across the task. Imagine feeding the classifier with the first two blocks and testing with the last two blocks. Anyway, as a general advice for cross-decoding, I recommend you to Z-code the signal across trial in both testing and training dataset. They will make values to a similar range. Another approach that we can see in the memory literature is this one. Following the idea that I introduced before, imagine that we want to understand how retrieval works. So which visual information we retrieve when we remember one object that we saw before. To answer this question, we can train a classifier when object and our screen and participant are encoding these images. So time zero in the y-axis represents object onset during encoding. Then we can test these models on visual perception, but in retrieval epoch. Here in the x-axis, the time zero could be when a cue is presented on the screen asking participant to remember one object. This pattern in the matrix will suggest that 400 milliseconds after cue presentation, participants start retrieving information about objects, and this information is similar to what participants process around 200 to 300 milliseconds during visual perception. Here, you can see one of the advantages of using time generalization matrices. In general, we will not expect to retrieve information in the same way that we are perceiving it. So that's why it's not so interesting to take a look only to the diagonal. So one example of this type of analysis can be found in this paper of Carl Nipson in eLabs, and I think it was one of the first time where I saw this kind of approaches. And of course, you can find other use of cross-decoding in the literature. For example, decoding information across different tasks, like we can see in this preprint, or in this other preprint by Federica Mecconi. So also, we can use decoding across participants. Why not? If we want to know how representations are shared across participants or across brains. So you can imagine training your dataset in the entire group and test it in every single participant. So doing a leave one participant out every time. I personally never use this approach, but only for having some fun. But of course, you can find a very interesting paper that was published like 3 years ago, where this author did something similar using MBPA in fMRI. Finally, I wanted to mention something that we could not comment in this video, and it is served light analysis in MBPA. If you want to know more about this, I would recommend you to read this primer that, although it's about fMRI, some of the points can be easily applied to EEG. I hope that can help. Finally, some readings that I previously mentioned, and of course, I wanted to let you know that the MBPA-like toolbox is also an excellent tool for time generalization method. That is so far, and see you soon in the practice session.